In 2001, Yossi Klein Halevi published a book entitled At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden. Maybe many of you have read it. It includes his encounters with people of many faiths, including a Sufi sheikh named Ibrahim, who said, "There are enough politicians in the land of the prophets. Where are the prophets in the land of the prophets?" Now, I won't burden Yossi with the label prophet, but anyone who's read his work knows that his is a measured, thoughtful voice that puts difficult issues in perspective. His articles appear regularly in the New Republic and on the editorial pages of major American newspapers like the New York Times. And we are pleased to have him speak with us this morning about why peace is elusive and how it can be achieved, which does sound something like a prophet might be able to enlighten us with. Please welcome Yossi Klein Halevi.
Good morning, thank you. A few weeks ago, I was part of a group of Israelis who were invited to meet with a visiting senator, a leading Democratic senator. I won't mention his name. And this senator proceeded to praise the Arab Spring, the spread of democracy. And then, without missing a beat, he said, "I think that you folks ought to think very seriously about renewing the Syria track, because who knows how much time the Assad regime has left. And you shouldn't miss that opportunity for peace, and you ought to really resume the negotiations." Now, there was a range of political opinion in that room among the Israelis, but virtually to a person, we all looked at each other in total disbelief. And the disconnect between someone who, on the one hand, is praising the spread of democracy and the fall of illegitimate regimes, and on the other hand, urging Israelis to trade the Golan, give up the Golan to an illegitimate regime that is murdering its own people in the streets, because this regime may fall to the will of the street, I think in some way neatly sums up a certain mindset that has become entrenched in Middle East discourse, which is that no matter what happens on the ground, this is always the moment to make peace. Always, Israel's about to miss one more golden opportunity to make peace. Now, the corollary, of course, or the mirror image of that is that we all know that within the Jewish community and in Israel, there are people who say it's never the time to make peace. And I remember the opposition to Menachem Begin during the Sadat Begin peace initiative. And thank God that Menachem Begin prevailed. And I have no regret, despite the nature of the Egyptian-Israeli peace and despite the fragileness of that peace today, I have no regret at all that we made the first and most successful Land for Peace agreement with Egypt. It bought us 35 years, and in these last 35 years, we have seen the economic and social transformation of Israel, and I think that peace with Egypt was an essential component of that. So the question really is, how does the current regional instability affect the prospects for peace? In the last few months, Israel has emerged as a kind of curmudgeon, at least in the perception of much of Western opinion. We're the ones who are continually warning about the consequences of the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. We're warning that instead of Prague 1989, this might well turn out to be Tehran 1979. The way in which the Obama administration dispatched with Mubarak, even though I understand that ultimately the United States had no choice but to turn against Mubarak, the rapidity, the lack of dignity with which this administration dispatched with its most cherished Arab ally sent warning signals throughout the Middle East, not only among Israeli leadership, but also among what remains of pro-American leadership. And I think parenthetically that the Hamas-Fatah alliance was inspired, at least in part, by a lack of faith on the part of Abbas, and he said this explicitly in his interview with Newsweek, in how America treats its allies. So when Israelis have raised these issues, the response tends to be, can't you Israelis ever get out of your doom and gloom mode and embrace hope? Tom Friedman has become a main exponent of the doom and gloom Israelis as opposed to the new era that's dawning. He wrote one column not long ago in which he said that Israel is so 20th century. And I hope that that quote comes to haunt him as the 9th century becomes more and more an option in the Muslim world. We've heard an exposition about the Muslim Brotherhood. I won't elaborate, simply to say that in Israel today there is deep fear that the West is once again deluding itself about the nature of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I'll give you one example that I think is particularly outrageous. Sheikh Qaradawi, who of course was the exiled Egyptian cleric who achieved prominence through Al Jazeera and recently returned to Egypt and delivered a Friday sermon in the square to 2 million people. Sheikh Qaradawi, about 2 years ago, referred to Hitler as a messenger of God to punish the Jewish people. Now, we all know this Italian fashion designer who has a Hitler problem when he drinks too much. And the media went into deep detail about this, I forget his name, this particular designer's Hitler problem, and yet Qaradawi's Hitler problem, which has far greater significance not only for the Jewish people but also for the West, has gone virtually unremarked in the reporting on his return to Egypt. So I think that's really symptomatic of a tendency in the West to try to sell itself the most optimistic scenario, and it's one of the reasons why Israelis tend to feel this urgency in projecting what for us is a compensatory, balancing perspective, but tends to sound relentlessly pessimistic. Now, where is the region heading? Not long ago, Bernard Lewis, the great Arabist of this generation, made an interesting remark. He said that in 5 years from now, Iran will be Turkey and Turkey will be Iran. Now, if we expand that for a moment to the region as a whole, I think it's a very useful measure for how the absolutely unpredictable is likely to happen. Egypt could become Muslim Brotherhood. Syria could turn against Hezbollah and Hamas. And one reason that I heard recently about why Hamas made its alliance with Fatah is that Hamas is afraid of its alliance with Syria collapsing, and it's looking now to establish an alliance with Egypt. So we're looking at regional changes that are profoundly unpredictable, not all of them negative. The negative possibilities here, I think, are clear to everyone, but the notion that Iran stands to be the great winner here could be true up to a point. If the Syrian regime collapses, that may be very bad news for Iran. And of course, the great hope is that the instability will return to Iran itself, encouraged by intensifying economic sanctions. Let's turn to the question of a Palestinian state and where we are in terms of negotiations. Natasha made a compelling argument about the need for Israel to define its borders. In principle, I agree. The question is this the time? Now, to step back for a moment before we deal with the actual moment, I'd like to just briefly explain the transformation of Israeli political discourse over the last years. For many years, the Israeli political debate was really characterized by left versus right, more or less equal camps perhaps in the 90s. And today, I would say that both the left and the right have won a crucial argument and also lost a crucial argument. And most significantly, a majority of Israelis today are neither left nor right, but in some sense a combination of the two sensibilities. The left won the argument that Israel as a Jewish democratic state, for demographic reasons, for moral reasons, for reasons of its standing in the international community, other reasons, Israel must embrace at least the principle of a two-state solution. That a two-state solution is an existential necessity for Israel. The right won the argument that founded under the wrong circumstances, a Palestinian state would be an existential threat to Israel. So that a majority of Israelis, I would call this the new centrist majority. For centrists, and I personally, I think you can hear this, I deeply identify with this position. We centrists believe that in principle, we're ready to make the deal, the Clinton proposal. In practice, no amount of Israeli concessions in the foreseeable future will win Israel genuine legitimacy, certainly not in the Palestinian camp, and given the most recent term of the unity between Fatah and Hamas, all the more reason to remain deeply, deeply wary of creating a Palestinian state under conditions that would almost certainly lead to the worst case scenario in the emergence of a pathological neighbor 5 minutes away from Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. So if I were to define myself politically, I am a dove in potential. I want to be a dove, but reality so far does not allow me to be, and in practice, I'm a hawk. And I think that a majority of Israelis would respond in various combinations of that left-right sensibility. The question about the right of return, and I think this is key, because very often the way the pictures painted of the Palestinian national movement, it's, well, Hamas are the radicals and Fatah are the moderates. And we saw just not long ago a great deal of media attention paid to the leaked Palestinian papers about the negotiations during the Olmert period, and the conclusion of virtually all the journalistic accounts that I read is that the Palestine papers show that the Fatah leadership, Abbas in particular, are prepared to forego the demand in practice of refugee return to Israel. I've read through a good deal of those papers. It is simply a distortion of what those papers contain. In fact, those papers contain the exact opposite. The message of those papers is that the bottom line number, the most forthcoming number that I saw in those papers were 100,000 refugees. Now, the position of the mainstream Israeli political system, I'm speaking for a moment now about Tzipi Livni. Tzipi Livni's position is not one refugee to return to Israel. If we're serious about partition, a two-state solution, it means that the Jewish state is responsible for ingathering the Jewish diaspora, or that part of the diaspora that wants to come home, and a Palestinian state will be responsible for ingathering its diaspora. That is the meaning of a two-state solution. As soon as you start fudging with the numbers or the principle of a right of return to the state of Israel, you are destroying the foundations of partition. So that, if anything, the Palestine Papers confirm that this generation of Palestinian leadership, with a few exceptions, and I think of Fayyad, for example, as one, Sairi Nusseibeh is on record as Sairi Nusseibeh is a long-term PLO leading figure, pretty much on the outs these days. And Sairi Nusseibeh said not long ago that the Palestinians have to get used to the idea that the right of return will be only to a Palestinian state. But that is still an isolated voice, and it led to him being discredited in the Palestinian national movement. Until those voices become normative, it is premature to speak about Fatah as opposed to Hamas as a moderate force. Yes, it's all relative. I prefer Fatah to Hamas. Fatah is not yet a partner for me in solving this conflict. So what will the deal look like? If we ever do reach a deal, I would frame it in the following conceptual way. It is my right of return to Greater Israel in exchange for your right of return to Greater Palestine. And I'll explain what I mean by that. The tragedy of this conflict is that you have two peoples, each of whom can make a compelling claim based on their own self-understanding, their own national narrative and experience of why the totality of this same piece of land belongs to its side. Now, for me as a Jew, Hebron and Shiloh and Bethlehem are, if anything, more resonant historically, religiously, than Cholon and Petah Tikva. So that when I'm in Hebron, I feel a deeper connection, a deeper affirmation of my rootedness in this land than I do in certain parts, frankly, of downtown modern Israel. When a Palestinian tells me, and I've had these conversations many times with Palestinians, why are you sending my family that lives in Lebanon to Hebron when we come from Haifa and Yafo? And my response is, I understand that. The only problem is that just as you're claiming a right of return to Haifa and Yafo, I have a right of return to Hebron and Shiloh. And that right of return for me is sacred. So that what we have here are two competing rights of return. And that brings us to the logic of partition. If we want to continue to argue historical narratives, and we can argue our historical narrative for the next 100 years compellingly, and we should, but I would like to see us reach a point where we can try to accommodate these two competing narratives. And if we're serious about a two-state solution, then we need to get to the point where each side is prepared to make the unbearably painful contraction of our historical claim to the totality of the same small tortured piece of land. That's how I understand a two-state solution. Which means that if we do reach a two-state solution, the way in which we will know that this is a fair solution is if both peoples feel cheated. And both peoples are in a state of mourning. Is it fair that we return after 2,000 years to Hebron and we voluntarily give up our physical claim to Hebron? No, it's not fair. And in that sense, I would regard a two-state solution, or part of me will regard a two-state solution as a historic tragedy that will take us perhaps generations as a people to recover from, and a part of us should never recover from that. A part of us should always be in mourning at the fact that we, the generation that liberated Hebron, and I have no problem using that language, we liberated Judea and Samaria, but we found ourselves in the tragic situation of occupying a people. I don't believe we're occupying that land. I am not an occupier in the land of Israel, but I am occupying a people. And I need to end, for all the reasons that you've heard over the last years, we need to end that occupation of the Palestinian people. So let's hold off on the applause, because this is a very complicated problem, and I'll also say some points that I'm sure will aggravate some of you who just applauded me. So let's really just try to keep focused on where we are. Now, one of the frustrations, how many more minutes do I have?
An hour.
Do, can I have another 5? Okay, great. Thank you. One of the frustrations that I feel as an Israeli who's on the lecture circuit among American Jews over these last years is a strong sense of disconnect between where the majority of Israelis are and where a majority of American Jews are. When I speak in Orthodox communities, I feel as if I'm back in the 70s and the 80s in Israel. And it's the days of Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, the pre-First Intifada days, when we thought we could continue to maintain what we used to call a benign occupation. That ended for most of us in the First Intifada. It ended for me personally, because that's when I was drafted into the Israeli army, and I was sent straight into Gaza in the First Intifada, in the Palestinian camps, and that was my introduction to a benign occupation. And I came out of that experience convinced we need to do everything we can to try to end this impossible situation. The Second Intifada was the reverse message. You can't make peace at this point. We tried, we put the deal on the table, and if you had asked any honest left-winger in the 1990s that if Israel would ever accept the deal which Ehud Barak accepted, and then the Clinton proposals after Camp David, would it bring peace? The answer of any self-respecting left-winger would have been, of course. And we then saw the consequences. Which means that the First Intifada turned us, most of us, into doves, and the Second Intifada turned us into hawks. But as I indicated earlier, one does not cancel out the other, because we are doves in potential. We want to be doves, and reality forces us to be hawks. I don't find that same ambivalence, that same anguished inner conflict among most American Jews as you have in Israelis. And I think that that's where distance tends to distort. When I speak to liberal Jewish communities, I get the opposite. It's the 1990s, it's the Oslo era. And it's as if the Second Intifada never happened. For right-wing American Jews, the First Intifada never happened, and for left-wing American Jews, the Second Intifada never happened. I live with both intifadas, and the consequences of the unbearable tension between the necessity to end the occupation and the impossibility of finding a trustworthy partner at this stage on the other side. So what my appeal then to American Jews, to the pro-Israel community, to those of you who love Israel, is to embrace Israel in its totality, to embrace the complexity of Israel. We need your nuanced support. We need defenders of Israel who are capable of projecting the complexity of this reality. It will make our case much stronger. So, where are we? What should we do? How do we navigate in this impossible situation? And here I'll end with a couple of brief observations. I believe that we need to do two things in the coming months. The first, those of you on the right will be upset with the first, and those of you on the left will be upset with the second. The first is that I believe we need to announce on our own initiative, without any American negotiations, without any expectation of Palestinian reciprocity, we need to announce an unconditional settlement freeze for the foreseeable future. Not in order to jumpstart the peace process, because it won't, because we're going to leave Jerusalem out of such a settlement freeze, and no government in Israel would include Jerusalem in the freeze. So why do the freeze? Simply to get the settlement issue off the table. This obsessive international focus, which is spreading now among liberal American Jewish circles. I debated Peter Beinart a few days ago at the American Jewish Committee Conference in Washington. Some of you may know the name. He's the former editor of the New Republic. He was my former editor. He brought me into the New Republic. And in the last year, he's turned into virtually a spokesman for the Palestinian negotiating position. And his focus in our debate on Friday was settlements, settlements, settlements. I want to get that issue off the table and refocus on right of return, right of return, right of return, because that's the obstacle, it's not settlements. The second principle that should be guiding us in the coming months is no premature Palestinian state under any conditions, whether imposed by the international community through the UN or with the illusion of a negotiating process. We need to resist a premature Palestinian state, which could lead to Hamas ruling in East Jerusalem. Now, I don't like Holocaust analogies applied to the Israeli situation. The existence of Israel, one of the essential characteristics of Israel is that we're not victims and we don't see ourselves as victims. It's not 1938. We're able to defend ourselves. My feeling, though, is that it may be in some form May 1967. Now, May 1967, for those of you who remember, and I came of age, my relationship to Israel came of age in May 1967. May 1967 was a concentrated moment of existential dread. We don't have that experience today. I would say that in Israel, the feeling about our place in the region is a kind of low-level, protracted May 1967 that could extend over months, perhaps even several years. And that is not a feeling of victimization, but it is a feeling of growing vulnerability. And that's an important distinction to make, because again, I think we sound hysterical when we speak about 1938, and from my point of view, far more realistic when we speak about May 1967. So, what is required of us, again, is nuance, complexity, an awareness of threat, and at the same time, an openness to the possibility, at least, that a transforming Middle East may also produce not only greater and greater threats, but perhaps some opportunities as well. I believe that if we're strong and steady and maintain some basic sense of Jewish unity, we will be able to turn threat into opportunity if and when the occasion arises. Thank you.
It's not quite noon, so we do have some time for brief questions. If anyone has any questions for Yossi, and while people are thinking about that, let me ask you one, Yossi, which is Netanyahu has mentioned the importance, he believes, of the Palestinians recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. How important is that?
I struggle with that question. I would have said, as somebody just called out here, very important. I would have once said essential and non-negotiable. I'm no longer so sure. And what I mean by no longer so sure is exactly that. I'm not sure. And the argument that I have with myself, and I can say, by the way, that the difference between a centrist on the one hand and a left-winger and a right-winger on the other, and I put left-wingers and right-wingers in the same camp of a sensibility, is that leftists and rightists argue with each other and a centrist argues with himself. And so I argue with myself about this question as well. And my sense is that we need to focus on right of return. That's the defining issue for us. And the reason I say that is because the Palestinian refusal, or put another way, the Palestinian insistence on exercising right of return and of demanding that Israel affirm their right of return, even in principle, I think that principle itself means that Palestinians have not yet internalized the notion that Israel or that the Jewish people has the right to national self-determination. If I have to accept the principle of Palestinian right of return, and I've said this to Palestinians, I will accept the principle of your right of return to Yaffo and Haifa, the principle and not implementation. If you accept the principle of my right of return to Hebron and Beit Lechem, and then not only will I waive implementation, but if we're serious about a two-state solution, I will, with all the pain and trauma involved, extract organic Jewish communities that have developed there for the sake of your ability to fulfill sovereignty in a Palestinian state. And the response that I get always is, it will never happen. We'll never recognize the principle of your right of return to Greater Israel. So that is another reason why I think we have to emphasize no principle of recognizing Palestinian right of return to Greater Palestine.
Thank you. As always, you have presented the complexity of the situation in a very articulate way. One thing that I think is also required is sabbalah. So with that in mind, and I don't think that the ultimate solution here will come under Netanyahu's watch, what kind of succession plan do you see? Who is waiting in the wings? Who is being...
On the Israeli side?
Yes, yes. What kind of...
I wish you would have asked Natasha that question.
What kind of leadership is there that will follow?
My sense is that Netanyahu could be with us for quite a while. I don't see the demographic makeup of the Israeli electorate changing anytime soon. The one wild card is that Aryeh Deri, who used to be the leader of Shas, is coming back. He is making a political comeback, apparently, in the next election. He is an interesting figure in that he is an ultra-Orthodox, dovish politician. And he could shift part of the Sephardi demographic that votes for Shas to the dovish camp, although I think he would find it very hard, given the attitudes in Israel today, to make that a credible move and remain long-term in power. I think that Deri is probably going to try to create a national unity government. I mean, he said as much, that would be his goal, to try to be the kingmaker. So I think we're going to see either some configuration of this coalition remaining in power, or perhaps, and this is my own personal hope, is a national unity government. And I say that especially because in the coming year or so, we may be finally approaching the moment of decision on Iran. And that's something we haven't talked about this morning. And it may well be in the next year. And if it happens, Israel could find itself in a war with several of our neighbors. Certainly Hezbollah, Hamas, Syria, we don't know. And given what is possibly facing us, I think we need to be focusing on national unity. And that, I would add parenthetically, is another reason for why we need to get the settlement issue off the table and focusing on preparing ourselves for what could be a very, very tough period ahead for Israel.
Okay, we're almost done, so, okay, you got 15 seconds.
All right, a woman at work, come on and take my 15 seconds away. A woman at work asked me, like, her son's married to a Palestinian. Why do we kick him out of his house and make him go in the woods? I don't know how to answer that, but you answer it. You know, the greatest.
Okay. Let's get the next question as well, real quickly.
I'd like to ask you why Netanyahu came up with this question about the Jewish state, because the United Nations in 47 decided that the independence paper. Israel is a Jewish state. Why he have to come up unless he's a...
Okay.
I don't know.
Take those two. The second question first. I understand why he's emphasized that. I think that at least in principle, that is an essential demand. I'm just not sure whether in practice it is. First of all, I don't think we're convincing very many people, and I think we have a much stronger case when we focus on right of return, but as I say, I really haven't made my mind up there. Now, in terms of the first question, that's a whole half a day seminar.
Give me a short answer.
Short answer is that the mainstream Zionist movement, which at the time, hard to imagine, but was actually led by the Labour Party, supported a two-state solution, supported the UN partition plan. The Arab world, the Arab League, which at the time was headed by someone named Azam Pasha, declared that the Arab nations were going to launch, and this is an exact quote, a war of extermination against the Jewish community in Palestine, the land of Israel. And that when you launch a war of extermination and you lose, there are consequences to that. And any place where Arab armies conquered in 1948, the Jews were completely expelled or massacred. Fortunately, there were very few places that Arab armies actually conquered in 1948. So it was a zero-sum war, and those were the terms that were declared by the Arab world. So, and if you factor in the expulsion, the emigration of 800,000 Jews from Arab countries as a consequence of 1948 as well, when you look at all of those conditions, then yes, the Palestinian refugee problem is a tragedy, but no, I will not take the rap for that. So.
Next question.
On this right of return, when in history has there ever been a right of return in any place? At the end of World War II, millions of Germans were forced out of their homes in Poland and Czechoslovakia. They're not advocating for return.
And Natasha and I are both beneficiaries of the right of return of the Jewish people to the state of Israel. And I think that what we need to remember as a people is that the return of the Jews home is a very peculiar. Let me just finish the sentence, and then the return of the Jews home is a peculiar and unique moment in history, and I think that was one of the reasons why the mainstream Zionist movement in the 1940s, again led by the Labour Party, and I personally miss in Israeli politics the old Mapai. I don't miss the corruption, but I miss that sensibility, that tough pragmatism of the old Mapai. They understood that because of the peculiar circumstances of our right of return home, we need to be receptive to a two-state solution. Did you want to rebut that?
I was not talking about the Jewish right. I'm sorry.
I know that, but my response to you is that coming out of our own experience of right of return, I have to, if I can, if my right of return is respected by the other side, I will have to, as painful as it will be, accommodate the right of return of the other side.
So a round of applause for Yossi Klein Halevi. And again, thank you to all our speakers this morning, Avi Posnick, Natasha Mozgovaya, David Brog, and Dr. Rachel Ehrenfeld, and Galit Baram from the Israeli Embassy.